Yes, thank you for that, and it's really good to be here with you this morning. As has been said, yeah, there's been some major developments on EUDR, which actually, from an AHEC perspective, we're very relieved if this proposal does go through. We think obviously the delay will be a very useful period where we can actually start to sort out some quite fundamental issues and problems that the American hardwood sector specifically has in relation to delivery against this law. And I just want to run through some of those problems. I'll just briefly provide you with an overview of what I want to talk about. I think I'll be talking for about 25 minutes or so. I'll try not to overrun, and then we can have some questions and answers after that. I just wanted to give you a brief overview of the American Hardwood Export Council's strategy in relation to, not only in relation to EUTR actually, but in relation to the wider range of regulations that are being developed worldwide for prohibiting the placing of illegal wood on the market. Of course, EUDR is just one part of that. I was going to say something about the political situation with regard to EUDR, although I think that's already been covered in some detail very well. So I don't need to go into detail on that again. Then talk briefly about US hardwood in the context of EUDR, and actually in the context also of the UK market, because the UK is now, by some significant margin, the largest market for American hardwoods in Europe. Then briefly talk to you about the assurance framework for legal and deforestation-free US hardwood that we are developing, which actually is designed, although it's designed to meet sort of 95% of the text of the EUDR, and to meet 100% of the objectives of the EUDR, it's not fully conformance with the law, and that has certain implications, and we need to do quite a lot of work to convince the EEC yet to accept the procedures and systems that we are developing. And we think we have an extraordinarily strong rationale for developing and presenting the system that we have. And then just briefly talk about some of the wider lobbying and promotion efforts that we're involved in, including calls for some specific targeted changes to the EUDR, which I know is problematic, asking for targeted changes to the text of the EUDR. But ultimately, over the long term, we feel that there are certain aspects of the EUDR that will need to be changed, that will need to be continued to challenge. And if it takes years, it takes years. But certain things do need to change inside the EUDR. That is our feeling, strong feeling. Yes, we are developing a new framework for demonstrating legal and deforestation-free American hardwoods in the global market. It's been branded under this organization called the Sustainable Hardwood Coalition, which actually we set up about 3 years ago, initially with the intent of developing a new certification system targeting small, non-industrial forest owners, jurisdictional risk-based approach, which we felt was most appropriate in that sector. But it's actually been repurposed now to deliver a deforestation-free and legal claim into the international market, obviously influenced by the events in the EU and the introduction of the EUDR in the course of the last 2 years. So just briefly to explain our strategy, AHEC, representing, of course, the American hardwood export sector, we're trying to develop, well, we are developing a whole industry framework to demonstrate deforestation-free and legal status. It is being branded under the Sustainable Hardwood Coalition brand. The initial phase of this work, actually, which we're undertaking now, is being funded through a program called the Regional Agricultural Promotion Program of the USDA, which actually, rather ironically, the funding we have now can be used to address all markets, with the exception of China and the EU. So it's actually for global export market promotion. And although the deforestation-free and legal system, of course, is influenced by what's happening in the EUDR, in the EU, it's actually designed very much for global export market development. And really, there's large focus on emerging markets as well. The approach is based on jurisdictional risk-based assessment, and that base and which provides a good basis, we think, when dealing particularly with wood from small non-industrial forest owners. It targets areas and issues where problems exist. The whole aim of it is to avoid implementing new requirements where there are not problems with regard to deforestation and legality. There's a very strong focus on legal conformance in a country like the US, which has obviously good governance. It doesn't reinvent the wheel. It does build on existing very high quality data sources and links to the US Forest Service. The US Forest Service has some of the best forest inventory data in the world, some of the best data on forest governance in the world, and it builds on that to provide a very robust assurance. It leverages the use of new technology. And actually, this is where we do have to thank the European Commission for pushing forward with the EUDR, because it has actually encouraged us, alongside a lot of other people, to look at how we can use certain new technologies, for example, with regard to remote sensing, using plant chemistry-based approaches to demonstrating provenance, how we can use these new technologies to develop new frameworks for verification, which we think actually meet the objectives of the EUDR and actually are very much in line with the wider development of global policy with respect to due diligence, legality verification around the world. It deals with, and this is very important in the US context, and I think it's probably important everywhere, but it's often not given enough consideration when looking at laws like and implementation of laws like the EUDR. It does deal with liability issues in the production country itself. For example, to the extent to which US hardwood mills can actually control the actions of private owners. There's certain issues to go up with regard to antitrust, commercial confidentiality, and privacy. And all those issues need to be dealt with in the conformance system that we are developing. And that's going to be a big part of the work that we do over the next 12 months or so. The system we're developing is aligned with actually all existing consumer country regulations, including the US Lacey Act, which actually is pretty key, considering a lot of American hardwood is exported from the US into Southeast Asia and other parts of the world, where it is manufactured into products and then returns to the US as manufactured product. So conformance to the US Lacey Act is pretty key with regard to the system that we're developing. It's very much in conformance with the EUDR, which of course still applies in the EU and will do until at least the end of this year. And the UK TR, so it's very much designed to be conformant with the UK timber regulation and all these other consumer regulations which have been developed in Australia, Canada, Korea, Japan, Indonesia, Malaysia, New Zealand, and Vietnam. As I say, with regard to EUDR, the system that we're developing delivers 100% against the objectives. It will provide an absolute assurance that there's a negligible risk of wood from either illegal or deforestation sources. And as I say, it will deliver what we're formalizing as about 95% against the EUDR technical requirements as they stand now, all the documentary evidence that's required to demonstrate legality and that the products are deforestation free. The only area where it doesn't comply is that we're providing geolocations for individual counties rather than individual properties through this system. And the reasons for that, actually, one of the reasons is quite simple, because the cost of delivery strictly in accordance with the EUDR text would cost the industry around, we've had estimates that it would cost the industry of at least $50 million per year to achieve that specific aim and objective. whereas the system that we're developing, which provides county geolocations, can operate at about 100th of the cost, for a cost of about $500,000 a year, to demonstrate county geolocations industry-wide. So there's obviously a big reason for demonstrating it just to use county-level polygons specifically on cost, but also there's a lot of other reasons with regard to legal obligations inside the US, privacy concerns, and actually the whole purpose of the regulation. We actually debate whether there's any actually value in going down to property level in order to demonstrate deforestation-free status, and actually whether it's actually even achievable, or actually it does anything in terms of mitigating risks with regard to deforestation. I'm not going to talk about the proposal to delay. I think that's already been covered. I gather you'll probably be covering that again just after my presentation. We're actually fairly confident that this proposal to delay will go ahead. I gather that the information we have, I gather that the Parliament is likely to vote on that next week. And as long as there's no change in the text of the Commission proposal to delay, it can actually be pushed through very quickly. So that hopefully that proposal will be endorsed by the end of next week. That's what we're hoping, and at this stage anticipating. Although it has to be said, the proposal to delay may yet be rejected by Parliament. That is a possibility. So just to ensure that we are still aligned with the timetable for EUDR, we are still very much aiming to deliver a form of assurance system by the end of this year, so that we are prepared in case the proposal to delay is not passed by Parliament. So we're still working pretty much to the same timetable we've always been working to, despite the proposal to delay. Although if it is delayed, it will mean that we can do a lot more work on delivery of the assurance system and on a lot of the other issues that we need to address, a lot of the legal issues that we're also looking at. Just to look at the US hardwood sector in the context of the EUDR. Yeah, the EU accounts for something like 10% of US hardwood exports worldwide. In 2023, I think there was nearly $300 million worth of exports of US hardwoods into the EU, if we're looking at log, lumber, and veneers collectively. The UK accounts for about 3%, about $100 million worth of product every year. So the UK is by a significant margin about the largest European market for US hardwood products. This trend is probably familiar to everybody. This is the trend of the exports of US sawed hardwood to European markets. It follows the pattern that everyone is familiar with, the big rise in 21 and 2022, and then a big collapse in 2023 with the slowdown in the global economy with the end of the post-COVID boom. And actually exports last year were around the level they were in 2020. And the exports to the UK there, you can see, are about a third of our exports into the European market. This year already, the UK is by far the strongest growth market for European markets, for US hardwoods in Europe. So the UK is becoming more important with every passing year in terms of exports into the European market. That's not to say the EU is not important. It's still a very significant market for the US. So we're certainly determined to keep hold of that market if at all possible, and to go as far as we can to conform with the requirements, and also to put a lot of effort into looking for specific changes in the law that we feel are necessary. Just to look at the actual underlying objectives of the EUDR and where the US as a whole stands in relation to the objectives. It's actually pretty clear. There's very clear evidence and information to demonstrate that commodity-driven deforestation across the US is extremely low. It's actually a negligible risk by any normal definition of what that entails. Every year there is around 17,000 hectares of land, of forest land, converted over to agriculture. So it does happen. It happens everywhere around the world. Wherever you are, there will be some conversion of forest to agricultural land. The question is it a systematic risk of conversion? Is it a significant risk of conversion? And on both criteria in the US, no, it's not. It's not systematic, and it's not a significant risk. In fact, I think every year it's about 0.005% of forest area is converted to agriculture every year. And actually, that's offset by the amount of agricultural land that is returned to forestry every year. So it's not a zero risk, it's a negligible risk, but it's a very, very, very small risk. And that is based on the EU's own EU observatory data. That's confirmed. The US DA have also done their own analysis. This rather than using satellite data, this is based on forest inventory data that the USDA has been running for about the last century. And this looks at a county level where there is any deforestation risk according to the EUDR definitions. And out of 3,000 counties US-wide, it did identify 14 counties where there was a certain level of conversion to agriculture. And even in each of those counties, wherever there was conversion to agriculture, it was more than offset actually by conversion of agricultural land back to forestry. So in terms of net conversion, it was zero, but in terms of there was some conversion to agricultural land. Just for those, probably most of you familiar with this, but I think it is useful just to provide a little bit of background about the US hardwood forest resource itself. It almost all comes from the eastern United States, this vast area of green here, which is privately owned forest. Most of the American hardwood resource is privately owned. It's a huge resource. It's essentially the actual area of the forest resource is 118 million hectares. I think that's about 5 times the land area of the UK. It's an enormous resource. The volume of hardwood standing in US forests has more than doubled over the last 60 years or so. It's gone from 5 billion cubic meters to 12 billion cubic meters. I think now it's about 13 billion cubic meters. It's increased again over the last 6 or 7 years. The rate of growth of that resource, though, is slowing, and that's to do with the history of forestry across the United States. Vast areas were deforested at the end of the Industrial Revolution, but they have been, over the last century, they've been growing extremely rapidly and extensively right across the United States, particularly in the eastern areas. But the rate of growth is now slowing, and that's because the forests are getting very old. They're reaching maturity, and the level of mortality now is rising quite sharply because we've got very old trees. And actually, the level of trees that are dying in the forest and without being removed, it now probably exceeds the level of removals. The level of removals now are probably the lowest they have ever been for at least the last 50 years or so. Whereas because the trees are very old, the level of mortality is rising. There is actually a really strong need to increase the level of harvest so that we can start regenerating more healthy stands in the US hardwood forest. The forests themselves are becoming very susceptible to invasives, to pests, disease. With climate change, we're seeing a lot more damage due to pests and disease and to wildfires. And actually now the level of mortality before harvesting is leading to the release of something like 160 million tons of CO2 to the atmosphere every single year. It would make a lot more sense to harvest a lot more trees before they die and rot in the forest. So that's where we are. We do need an increase in harvesting across the US hardwood sector, but actually at the present time, the level of harvesting is probably the lowest it has been for about 50 or 60 years. One of the reasons for that is actually a lot of the forest is privately held amongst small non-industrial forest owners, many of whom are not actively managing their forests for timber. This is just showing the supply of hardwood from US hardwood forests. Something like 90% of removals are on privately owned land, and something like 75% of removals come from land which is in the hands of non-industrial forest owners, of which there are over 9 million across the United States, each with an area of only about 11 hectares of forest. So that is the supply base, and I'll explain a little later why that is so profoundly important when we're dealing with laws like EUDR, and why it creates real obstacles to the delivery of particularly the geolocation data with regard to the EUDR. We do have specific problems with some of the legal text of the EUDR from the perspective of supply from non-industrial private forest owners. A big problem for us is this requirement that each plot of land must be within a single real estate property. And this implies that we need to provide extraordinarily precise, very specific, very disaggregated data in areas where we have non-industrial forest ownership, which is the vast majority of the US hardwood resource. However, that definition of within a single real estate property is entirely meaningless in the context of the 73% of the world's forest area, which is in public ownership, which, of course, right across the boreal forests of the north, right across the tropical forests of the north, almost all that land is in state or public ownership. Or might even be might be owned by indigenous lands in certain areas, none of which this within a single real estate property, whether that definition actually is pretty meaningless. So it does mean we can see in tropical regions, for example, you can actually more or less choose how you define the plot of land, and you could even you could even use the whole concession, some of which are over several hundreds of thousand hectares large. That could be implied as being within a single real estate property. So it does imply very vague, rather non-specific and endlessly flexible data in those areas, very different to the situation in the United States. The definition of negligible risk in the EUDR is rather vague. It's defined as no cause for concern. There's very little guidance. I don't think even in the new guidance is there any guidance on whether there's any acceptance of a sort of de minimis requirement. And in fact, in the guidelines provided to date, there seems to be zero tolerance interpretation, so that no cause for concern actually means zero cause for concern. You actually have to make sure that every single geolocation, no matter how small, remains under forest and is not converted to agriculture, irrespective of how large a proportion of each consignment that is making up. There are much better definitions of negligible risk. For example, the UK Health and Safety Acts, for example, refer to as low as reasonably practicable, or they also, in the chemical sector, it often refers to no further regulation would be effective in reducing risks. These would be better definitions of negligible risk, but the EUDR has chosen this rather vague and zero tolerance approach to risk. And of course, there's the in excess option, which is the only option available for products which are aggregated and mixed from numerous small operators. The approach, of course, is to provide a list of all plots of land where the commodity might have been harvested. And as I say, there's zero tolerance in the guidelines. It does state quite clearly, if one plot of land geolocalized in the due diligence statement is not compliant, the entire set of plots of land geolocalized is non-compliant. And I'll show you why this is actually profoundly challenging for the US hardwood sector to deal with. It does seem to imply an endless liability in the supply of US hardwood products into the EU market. And another thing which often isn't really thought about, there doesn't seem to be any time limit on liabilities. A lot of people are saying, oh, well, as soon as it's placed on the market, the product and the regulator has sort of rubber stamped it, it's placed on the market. There's no time limit after that event. There's no liability after event. But I don't think that can be true. I think once the product is on the market, it can still be investigated, and the regulators could go back and look at products already in the market. And 3 or 4 years later, they could actually say, oh, actually, there is deforestation associated with that consignment, and there could be penalties for placing that product on the market a couple of years before. And this creates real problems for the US hardwood sector in supplying the EU. Now, I use this slide to try and explain why the US hardwood sector has a real problem with certain EUDR requirements. If you're dealing with agricultural products, EUDR actually probably makes quite a lot of sense. It's actually relatively simple to interpret because you're always dealing with a past deforestation event. So if a forest is harvested and cleared before the cutoff date of 30th December 2020, then all crops from that piece of land, obviously, they can be placed on the EU market. That's easy to understand. If the forest is harvested and converted to agriculture after the cutoff date of the 30th December 2020, then all agricultural crops, of course, cannot be placed on the EU market. Very easy. There's legal certainty there. You just have to look. If you're looking at satellite data, for example, it's easy to check whether the agricultural crop is being grown on a piece of land that was converted before the cutoff date or after the cutoff date. It's very easy to do that. If you're looking at wood products, though, things start getting rather complicated. Again, theoretically, if a forest is converted before the cutoff date and the wood products are off that forest enter the EU market, then of course those wood products are fine. If in the second scenario, though, of course, it does seem that the products, once the forest at the time of the harvesting, if those products are placed on the market after the cutoff date and the forest was converted after the cutoff date, then of course theoretically they cannot be put on the market. But those logs are already in the supply chain, so there's not much people can do about that because it's obviously happened. It wasn't clear at the time of the harvest whether that area of forest was going to be converted or not. And this is going to be a continuous problem with regard to forest products. You always have to be sure that once the forest is harvested, that forest will not be converted in the future. And looking at satellite data, for example, it can take several years before it can be clear whether that forest has been converted or not. Unless the forest is in state ownership, you can never be absolutely sure that the landowner, if a mill is buying the wood from a private individual, you can never be certain that that private individual will not convert the forest, having harvested the trees. And unless it's certified, and even if it is certified, there's no guarantee that a forest harvested for timber is not going to be subsequently converted. And you can't use satellite data. It'll take several years before it's clear whether that area of forest is going to return back to forest or whether it's going to be converted to agriculture. So this is going to be a big area of uncertainty in the supply of forest products if you're ever buying it from private forest owners. And in the US, of course, the risks of that conversion are extremely low, but the problem arises because so much wood comes from so many small non-industrial forest owners, and of course it gets mixed during the process of delivering it into the EU market. I've just tried to show here that some of the complexities of the supply chain and the degree of mixing that's required, and aggregating and mixing that's required in delivering American hardwoods into the European market. The US hardwood sector has something like 2,000 sawmills. Each sawmill will buy logs from a radius of about 100 miles. So it will come from an area of about 8 million hectares for in each individual sawmill, in which there will be several 100,000 forest properties. The mill will be buying from maybe 200 or 300 very small harvest sites each year. Each of those harvest sites is mainly small, low-intensity selection harvesting. A typical mill in the US will maybe buy about 45% of its logs maybe bought standing. 5% might come from company lands, but another 45% may be hauled to the sawmill by the landowner or the loggers, or might come through mills, other mills, or log brokers. So although 50% can usually be tracked back to the specific harvest site, about 50%, it's much more difficult to do that and to provide data on the specific harvest site. And the numbers of harvest sites for each individual mill are enormous every year, and they vary. And the next year there'll be a completely different set of harvest sites. And when the logs enter the mill, they will be sorted by species, size, and grade. I was at a mill only last week in Pennsylvania where they were where for each species they have about 8 or 9 species. For each of those species, they were separating into 5 grades, and then dividing each of those into 7 grades by color. So 35 grades for each individual species. So in order to aggregate consignments for delivery to the export market or to the concentration yards, there are literally 100 different sorting grades being in each mill. And then a lot of the exports don't come from individual mills. A lot of it comes through concentration yards. This is the data for a typical mid-sized exporter. It might be sourcing from about 80 to 100 different suppliers, which will be sourcing in turn from several million different forest owners, and potentially 50,000 to 30,000 potential harvest sites are distributed across several states. So, and that exporter may then be involved with further mixing and sorting to match customer specifications. So in practice, I was talking to one of these exporters again last week. He was telling me that each individual consignment, they would probably have to provide up to 20,000 different polygons if they were going to try and capture all the possible properties from which that product could have derived. So the actual numbers of potential geolocations for each individual consignment are just unrealistically large to be put together and amalgamated in for each consignment. So we are developing a system that is designed to overcome these issues. And the aim is to enable all consignments of products containing US hardwood to be accompanied by all the documentation needed to demonstrate legal and deforestation origin, including the geolocation data. But the solution that we've come up with is, instead of trying to amalgamate all these thousands of polygons for individual properties, it is to provide the geolocations of the actual counties from which the products have derived. So the system itself, it'll comprise 4 different components. Firstly, an annual deforestation assessment to identify county level trends. And to do this, we're buying, or the company that we're commissioned to do this, a company called BWA, who are going to do this satellite analysis on an annual basis. They are being provided with data from the European Space Agency, Sentinel-2 satellite data, which actually is already being compiled by another company, Cebu Technologies. They'll be using that data and linking that with the US forest inventory data to do every year a very detailed analysis, very resilient and robust analysis of the level of deforestation in each individual county across the US. The analysis will be of such high resolution, they will be able to identify exactly what is driving deforestation, whether it's urbanization, if it's a particular crop, and to identify whether that deforestation is a systematic trend or a sort of random trend, that is not leading to systematic change. And that will be used as the basis for making the deforestation-free claims. The other side of it is we're commissioning, and we have commissioned 33 individual statewide legality risk assessments. These have been actually commissioned so that they're very much in line with a protocol which has been developed, which is aligned with the EUDR legality requirements. I think it's probably the most detailed legality assessment ever undertaken anywhere in the world. It's at a very high level of resolution, again, at the state level, not at national level, but at a state level. It's been undertaken by Dovetail, an independent company with a lot of expertise in risk assessment, having done a lot of work with FSC on controlled wood, but with a lot of knowledge of and detailed understanding of the smallholder sector in the US. And we're developing a web portal, initially, the first phase of this, so that we have something on the table before the end of this year, is designed specifically for US hardwood exporters so that they can generate standardized due diligence statements, drawing together the data from the deforestation assessment and the legality risk assessment. And then next year, it says by 30th of June 2025, sorry, but actually that'll probably be ready, we think, by September now, 2025. And that's to link, to expand the web portal so that it can be used by mills across the US and also by companies in the export market chain. And that will be linked to a chain of custody standard, and it will also be linked to requirements for the mills to undertake mitigation actions, and it'll set out requirements for information exchange throughout the supply chain. Just to highlight some of the data quality that we're able to draw on in doing the deforestation risk assessment. The US does have very high quality satellite-based data sets. For example, the USDA cropland data layer, which has been produced by the USDA for about the last 20 years or so, which does look at a 30-meter by 30-meter resolution. It can identify, and it does identify where the forests are, what crops are on each piece of land, and how that changes year on year. So very good quality data. We will be using an improved data set, which is based on this, but it's a higher resolution data set. But even then, this is good quality data, but even then, the data quality is not good enough to allow enforcement at individual property level. There's a lot of actual ambiguity in the data. There are problems with the algorithms in identifying individual crops. It's very good for demonstrating change at a county level and looking at trends at a county level. It's not good enough, actually, for enforcement at an individual property level. So all the talk of the EU looking at individual satellite data and being able to identify exactly where the trees are and have is actually, to my mind, under current data quality, the level that's likely to be available to regulators, they simply will not be able to do that. However, they will be able to check at a county level what the risks are of deforestation. So this slide sets out why we are focusing on provision of county level polygons instead of property level polygons. County level data is very manageable. There are 1,360 counties across the US, which account for about nearly 100% of the hardwood supply. Nearly all of those are in the eastern United States. The provision of county level data is, and the polygons, it is equitable in relation to state forest areas, tropical concessions, and industrial plantations. The average area of a county in the United States supplying hardwood is about 100,000 hectares, which is a similar sort of area to a large industrial forest plantation. As I emphasized earlier, using county level polygons means that we can implement this system for about 1/100th of the cost of what would be required to implement and try and roll out this system at a property level across the US. County level geolocations can also be verified simply by using plant chemistry based provenance technologies, things like trace element analysis, stable isotope ratio analysis, these LIBS handheld technologies, which will in time, we think, be able to allow identification of timber species to specific areas. Those technologies will be in time able to identify the provenance of timber in the marketplace to within an area of about 40 miles by 40 miles. That's what we gather from the technical experts. That's about the size of a county in the US. So those technologies can be used to identify provenance and will be able to be used to verify the status of claims of county level provenance, but not property level provenance. Counties are sufficiently compact to ensure homogeneous level of deforestation risk. And actually, if you look at the definition of a plot of land in the EUDR, it does emphasize this need to be able to identify areas, homogeneous areas of risk, which actually property level, that doesn't really mean anything, but that really is applying to, that really does imply that you should be looking at slightly larger landscape areas where you can identify homogeneous areas of risk. And it resolves all the confidentiality as an antitrust issue surrounding provision of data on individual properties. I'm probably running out of time, so I won't spend a lot more time on this. This is actually just reiterating some of what I said before about the different phases of the project. We're working very hard at the moment at this first phase portal, which is essentially to extend a system that we're already operating called the American Hardwood Environmental Profiling System, which provides a consignment-based document providing all the environmental and legality compliance information with that in relation to individual consignments of American hardwoods. We're going to use this framework to develop a system which delivers the due diligence statements very much similar to those which are required by the EUDR, and also to provide the geolocation data using for individual counties, using in line with the EUDR specification for that geolocation data. And the second phase, which we're going to be developing next year, is to extend the web portal to link it specifically with a chain of custody standard, and that will bring in the mills in the US and require them to implement mitigation actions to ensure if they are sourcing from any counties where there is an identified risk of illegal harvest, they will have to undertake mitigation actions in relation to those specific counties. And it will also set out procedures for conveyance of the due diligence data right the way through the supply chain, and so it can be traced through third countries as well, including the UK, but also particularly we're looking at countries like China and Vietnam, and it will be linked to a framework for independent third-party chain of custody verification. Ongoing work in parallel, we're developing this work alongside work with the US Wood Identification and Screening Center. They're the ones that are actually leading the development of these plant chemistry-based techniques to identify provenance. To do that, though, this sort of data is, and these sort of systems are very dependent on preparing very detailed and extensive databases of timber samples from right across the growing region. And that there's a program we will be rolling out over 3 years to collect all these timber samples from across the US hardwood growing region, so that within a period of about 3 years, we hope that we will be able to test individual pieces of American hardwood, wherever they are in the world, to identify their county provenance. And it will, in time, we hope, allow actually more targeted application of chain of custody auditing. So it will just focus very much on those supply chains where there is evidence of abuse. We are seeking some very specific changes ultimately to EUDR. We think that the definition of a plot of land should be changed. And actually, they're very important and clear changes that we're proposing, but they're not big changes in terms of actually the amount of text that needs to be altered. We're looking very specifically, very targeted changes to the text. The plot of land definition should remove the reference to within a single real estate property. We're actually thinking our proposal is it should define an area of land delineated for geolocation and traceability purposes within a single integrated management unit, or in the context of smallholders and local communities, a single jurisdictional area, mill supply area, or cooperative association, or in the context of indigenous peoples, a single tribal area or reservation. We think if they made that amendment to the law, that could actually make the whole law much more workable and much more accessible for particularly for wood from small non-industrial forest owners. We think there should be a de minimis definition somewhere at least in the guidance, so that it does allow for a small proportion of deforestation, non-systematic change, where there is everywhere in the world, there is a little bit of deforestation. The question is it systematic, and is it leading to is it going to become a long-term problem? That's what we're really trying to avoid. There needs to be a time limit for liability post-harvest. The law doesn't say anything about the time limit for liability post-harvest. Once products are on the market, at what point can the regulators come back and prosecute for events that occurred sort of 3 or 4 years before? We do need to have more clarity on that. And also, there needs to be limits up to the liability of wood product suppliers when deforestation is driven by non-wood commodities, because in the US hardwood sector, yes, there is certain conversion to agriculture, but that's not driven by the hardwood harvest. That is driven by the agricultural commodities that move in after the hardwoods have been removed. And in the US context, most of those agricultural products are not even regulated by EUDR. So we're now just involved in, over the next 12 months or so, we are going to be engaged in some very far-reaching lobbying and promotion activities, working very much with our EU trade partners to encourage measures that work for both internal and external trade. With very strong links with the US government and wider industry representatives, and also with other trade partners to work on common approaches. We're particularly keen to promote jurisdictional risk-based approaches for smallholders in the forest products sector. We're going to be promoting worldwide this SHC legal and deforestation-free assurance system to demonstrate that it's effective, efficient, it's equitable, it's entirely WTO conformant, and it will be based on internationally recognized definitions. And we will be commissioning early in 2025 specific legal advice. We'll be looking for more advice on WTO implications. We actually did get some legal advice on WTO implications last year, where it was actually pretty clear that the law as currently constituted is not aligned with WTO rules for various reasons. But we're looking again at that, and I think we can strengthen our position on that. We're particularly keen to ensure that any concessions made to facilitate domestic industry and EU products exports, that there are actually certain concessions being made to internal trade. We've been keeping a very close eye on those, and that whether that leads to increased discrimination against imports. We're very keen on ensuring that in order for the EU to justify its claims that the law is compliant with the WTO, that it is providing equal treatment both to internal suppliers and to external suppliers into the EU. We are looking for a legal assurance that county polygons are sufficient for a low-risk country. We're looking effectively for a legal defense in the event of a challenge. We think that we will be able to get that because we are fully meeting the objectives of the legislation and the vast majority of the technical requirements. We're also looking very closely, we'll get advice on the US legal implications, including antitrust, privacy, the implications with regard to infringements to private property rights, and also looking at the possibility of Lacey Act infringements if EU exports are non-conformant to EUDR, because actually the EU is a larger exporter of forest products both around the world and into the US than the US is an exporter of forest products into the EU. So that's quite a big deal. If the EU is making concessions to the domestic industry that allows it, for example, to export without provision of geolocation data, whereas it requires provision of geolocation data on imports, that may be seen as an infringement of the Lacey Act in the US. And we're also looking at the question of contract clauses to ensure that EU importers place no unreasonable liabilities with regard to EUDR conformance on their overseas suppliers. So that's what we're doing, and thank you very much. The website for the system that we're developing, where it's got all the details, there's the address, shc-cert.org, and happy to answer any questions or to answer them now or at any point in the future. Thank you.
Thank you, Rupert. Thanks for going through that. Very detailed overview of what the US American Hardwood Association are doing there. Before we open up to questions, I just had a quick question on whether you'd been linking with other commodities with this, or focusing primarily on hardwood export at this stage, or whether other commodities were having similar problems.
Yes, obviously we have been following very closely what's happening in other commodity sectors, and absolutely. I mean, the US has been, as you know, has been calling for a delay for this regulation for some considerable length of time. We certainly, the American hardwood sector is working directly with other commodity sectors in the US through various committees. We've also been involved quite heavily in quite a lot of international discussions, particularly in Southeast Asia. And yes, of course, the palm oil sector and the coffee sector, particularly, they have very significant problems with this legislation. Whole countries are actually being omitted from the EU market already. For example, Ethiopia has been omitted from the from essentially being left out of the EU supply chains now because it can't comply with the technical requirements. We have had direct conversations with the cocoa sector, and they, because the EU is such a huge market for chocolate around the world, I think it takes about 50% of cocoa trade worldwide, and it is very dependent on just two countries, on Ivory Coast and Ghana, and we have had conversations with them. They obviously they see this as a huge opportunity to actually get more funding for development of regulatory programs in the country. So they're actually more keen that this thing moves forward rapidly than perhaps other sectors. And I know they have been developing some fairly sophisticated procedures for implementation of EUDR conformance. I mean, they did, when in our conversations with them, they heard what we had to say and essentially said, "Oh, well, why on earth is our forest products even covered by this regulation? It would be much better just to stick to the timber regulation, which is much more appropriate for forest products than the EUDR, which is actually adapted to agricultural commodities." To which, well, there's no real answer to that, except the EU weren't listening when they prepared this original legislation.
Mm. No, thanks, Rupert. Yeah, just more out of intrigue than anything else with that one. So I know you will have been liaising with it every which way, but you can. I don't know if anyone else has any questions for Rupert following the presentation at all. I haven't seen anything in the chat, just a few bits on FAQs for EUDR.
But anyone please do. Oh, good. Peter.
Pete?
Yeah, hi, sorry. I did send it to Rupert, I think, in the chat. During your presentation, you said there were 14 counties that had registered deforestation. I think the county approach is definitely the way forward to go. We have done an analysis using a satellite company. We've done a couple of county level analysis in North America, and in each one we've done so far, we've hit deforestation. So the kind of question is, am I unlucky hitting 14 out of a couple of thousand counties, or is there a difference between somebody else's technology and what Sentinel-2 is going to kind of say? And if there is a difference, who can I take is right and who's wrong? Because the wonderful thing about the AHEC approach is going to be that risk analysis is all going to be done almost for us, so we don't have to redo it ourselves, which is going to save us a lot of time, money, and investment. But if your approach is going to be different, who's right and who's wrong is kind of like where it fits in. So is that information publicly available so we can start checking some of our suppliers off?
Yes. First thing to point out, yes, I think it was 14 counties, but that wasn't our analysis. That was the analysis undertaken by the USDA using forest inventory data. So it was a longer term analysis. I'm intrigued to see exactly the basis of the satellite analysis you did, what years you were comparing, whether you were looking at trends over a sort of 7-year period or just looking 1 year to the next.
Because
I'll
happily share it with you, Rupert. I'll send it to you later if you want to have a look at it.
No, that would be really useful. With our own analysis, which is being undertaken now, looking directly at the satellite data, which is initially going to compare 2019 to 2013, is not available yet. But will it be available? It will be publicly available. There will be a publicly facing website where this data is all made publicly available. Absolutely. That will be part of it. So it's not just going to be an enclosed system. That data is all going to be publicly available. It's going to be completely transparent, and it will identify, what the drivers are. We are, in fact, next week I've got a meeting with the people doing this analysis on our behalf. They're actually due to have completed the first draft of that analysis by the end of this month. I'll certainly, as soon as I know the results of that, I'll let you know. But at this stage, we haven't seen the results yet, so we don't know how many counties will be implicated as where there are risks of deforestation. But certainly, the intention is that it will all be publicly available, and the analysis that they are doing will be the most up to date that can be achieved using data sources that are a reasonable cost. There's a lot of questions to be answered about how do you identify deforestation, what time period is the most appropriate for identifying it. If you just look from 1 year to the next, you can't really identify deforestation because forest land that's harvested for trees, usually it'll go through a period when it's obviously been harvested, and then it'll go through a period of when the land might be barren or it might be identified as bare land, and then at some point in the up 3 or 4 years that you might be able to spot crops coming up. But it will take 3 or 4 years before you can tell whether it's crops coming back or it's trees coming back. So I'd be interested to know exactly what the basis of the deforestation assessments have been for the analysis that you've been commissioning. I'd be quite interested to see that.
No, I'll happily send it. So just to come back on it then. So where they said it's done by forest inventory, that is boots on the ground, people walking the particular areas, taking a fully
well, they've got exactly. It is. It's based. Well, it's done by. They have sample plots right away across the United States. I think they've got about 8,000 sample plots, and they do combine that with satellite data. But their inventory is it's a rolling program. They cover the whole of the US every 7 years, so they're looking at trends over a period of 7 years from the and it's not the same year every year. So it's certainly not the best basis on which to do this analysis. That's why we're commissioning our own, which is based on very much the latest data. But it was to provide us with some sort of indication of how big the problem might be, and they came up with a figure using that process of, I think it was 14 counties across the US out of 3,000, where they could identify deforestation, which was driven by agriculture to any significant degree. But you'll know, I mean, a lot of the, as I emphasised, there's no such thing as zero risk. There will always be some change, some conversion to agriculture everywhere in the world. There's always some, even if it's around the margins, unless everything is totally protected. If you've got private forest owners, you will have some conversion to agriculture. It's inevitable.
Yeah, thank you.